Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this last session of the Cycling and Walking Innovations Day. Really warm welcome to everybody. My name is Susan Claris. I'm a transport planner at Arup, and I'm also the Vice President of Living Streets, the UK charity for everyday walking, and I'm a trustee for the charity as well. It gives me great pleasure to be able to chair this final panel, which is about pedestrian networks and proximity planning. I'm really pleased to say we've got 5 speakers coming up, each of whom will talk for, I hope, a maximum of 5 minutes. We will have Glenn Lyons talking about walking as a service, followed by Anna Rose on walking planning tools, Ed Nicholas on local walking for health schemes, Emma Griffin will be talking about the Footways project, and then we'll have Tienery Lovell finishing on talking about walking in livable neighbourhoods. And then after that, we will have time for a Q&A session. So do please post any questions that you have in the chat as we go through. But it gives me absolute pleasure to ask Glenn Lyons, who is Mott MacDonald Professor of Future Mobility based at UWE in Bristol, to start by talking about walking as a service. Thanks, Glenn.
Thanks so much, Susan, and good afternoon, everybody. My pleasure to be here. Well, there's been a lot of excitement, and it's fair to say hype, within the transport sector about mobility as a service, or MaaS for short, in recent years. Conspicuous by its absence in this has been walking. Well, perhaps this is because MaaS is about selling mobility beyond the private car, and there's no money to be made from walking, right? Wrong. At least this is what I'm venturing to suggest. 2 years ago this month, I coined the phrase walking as a service in a LinkedIn post. To my pleasant surprise, it attracted quite a lot of interest, so much so that I ended up writing and publishing a paper on it. Some people thought this might be the latest offering from Silicon Valley to disrupt the mobility sector. Well, yes and no. So what do I mean by walking as a service? Abbreviated, somewhat unfortunately I have to say, to WAS. Well, in its simplest terms, it's a collaboration between the oldest modes of transport, our feet, and the latest technological innovation, Google Maps navigation. Crucially, WAS helps overcome the following 3 things for the individual that may discourage them from walking to their destination. 1, I don't know my way and might get lost. 2, I don't know how far it is. And 3, I don't know how long it would take. Such matters of wayfinding are an important accompaniment to matters of walkability when considering how to unlock the untapped potential of walking for journeys or journey stages under 2 miles. Indeed, if something of a renaissance in walking is happening, then it may be attributable in part to WAS. While MaaS is still struggling to find the sweet spot of meeting both the needs of shareholders and of sustainability, I believe WAS may already have found it. I imagine many, if not all of you in this session, have at some point used Google Maps navigation in order to get somewhere on foot. You have WASed to the destination, if I might put it that way. WAS is not a pipe dream of intelligent mobility like MaaS or CAVs, some might say. It's already a global phenomenon. So how is the existence of WAS made possible? Am I simply telling you that WAS is nothing more than sat-nav for pedestrians? Well, at its heart, as I understand it, WAS is about selling access to geography, as opposed to MaaS selling access to mobility. And a circle of virtue is at play, or could be, especially in our urban areas. And it goes as follows. Investment in walkability of our built environment and Google's investment in the navigability of that built environment increase the propensity for people to walk. Businesses choose to put themselves onto Google's map to make themselves more discoverable. In so doing, they enrich Google's navigational offer to individuals because of the landmark information created. Increased walking then leads to more passing trade for such businesses, which means that the local economy sees benefit. Google is making money from advertising, even if not directly monetizing WAS. It's not a charity after all. It is connecting prospective customers with businesses selling their wares. Economic growth then creates opportunity for further investment in walkability, and growing profits for Google create the incentive for more investment in mapping and navigation. This again holds the prospect for further increases in walking and perhaps growth too in the number of businesses in the local area. The beauty of WAS is that it can help move from not walking to semi-autonomous walking to fully autonomous walking. Slightly tongue-in-cheek there, but in other words, for a journey I might not have made on foot, WAS empowers me to choose to do so. And if I repeat that journey, I'll eventually no longer need WAS because my feet will automatically know where they're going. During the pandemic, WAS has perhaps not seemed as relevant, as it's been more about rediscovering our neighbourhoods rather than exploring truly new places. Yet, as we eventually begin to emerge from the pandemic, we need, of course, to see walking elevated in its standing and popularity as a behaviour. And paying attention to WAS and the WAS circle of virtue is part of this, I would suggest. It would be wise to scrutinise the true motives of Google and what this means for the future of its offer to pedestrians. But if there is a sweet spot, then we should be asking, how can other players build upon, learn from, or shape what Google Maps navigation is achieving for pedestrians? For example, how can we ensure that the suggested routes Google provides are best serving the pedestrian in terms of the walkability issues they're exposed to, such as safety, security, air quality, noise, aesthetics, and so on? We must guard against innovations in mobility that could, for profit or in the supposed interests of consumer convenience, see walkable trips being unduly undertaken by motorised means. After all, let's face it, walking is the truly intelligent form of mobility. Thank you, Susan.
That's great. Thank you for that, Glenn. As you can imagine, it's music to my ears to hear walking described that way as the truly intelligent form of mobility. And I do like the idea of WASing or WAS to the destination. That's introduced some whole new words into my vocabulary. So thank you very much for that. If we can follow on, please, with Anna Rose, who is a director at Space Syntax, and she'll be talking about walking planning tools. Over to you, please, Anna.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to talk about the tools we developed at Space Syntax for walkability and how we can use that, how we can use them to use more data to inform our planning. I have a few slides here, so if I could have the first slide, that would be great. Yes, so I'm just showing this slide with two very contrasting images because we often think about local physical qualities of the built environment first when we think about walkability. What I'm going to talk about now is that actually we have to look beyond those images. We have to think about what are all the different parameters which determine walkability and how they come together to create the conditions we need to improve walkability. So we need an integrated thinking approach about all these parameters. If we go to the next slide, so obviously one of the most important parameters is land use planning and how things are spatially distributed and how they are connected through the spatial layout and connectivity. So we have population in different places, and what do they need to do, where do they need to go every day, and how can they get there. So this is really important in terms of planning. If we go to the next slide, so what we started to do, we started to take our spatial connectivity models and link them with land use models. So what you can see here expressed with the building plots is in the colors, every building which has within 5 minutes walking distance the highest number of different land uses, indicating a sort of diversity of land use on your doorstep, indicating that you can do most of the things you need to do every day by walking. If we go to the next slide, you can then also bring the time factor in if you look at traveling by different modes. So this is a car dependency tool where we again link the spatial network with the speed of the network, depending if you're using a car and the road speed, walking and cycling and the associated speeds. And then also we link this to travel time and timetable data of public transport, and we look at how many employment opportunities can I reach within 1 hour. If we look at the next slide, this is actually where all of these things come together in one algorithm, looking at a city and looking at the combination of the spatial network, where things are, where people need to go. The different travel times public transport component is in here as well. So you develop a tool where you can combine all these different parameters in one place, and that then lets you identify as a planner where are the areas in the town where we can optimize these relationships to encourage more walking and cycling. Where should we put things to make this possible, this lifestyle? So the final slide I want to show is an image from Berlin, if we can see this, because I think this combines the 1-minute city, just in front of the doorstep. We have a cafe here. The 15-minute city, you see people walking and cycling, but you can also see the big main road is one of the arteries leading out of the center. You see the S-Bahn track leading you to the airport and beyond Berlin. So basically this multi-scale accessibility by different modes of transport at different speeds, combined with the mix of users and the distribution of the population in relation to this. All these things come together in our neighborhoods and provide the conditions for sustainable, resilient urban systems. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much for that, Anna. And it's great to hear that at the heart of sustainability and resilient urban systems, which is where I think it should be. So that was really good, and a lovely example of Berlin at the end of that. So thank you for that. Next, please, we have Ed Nicholas, who is the Short Group Walks Programme Manager at the Ramblers, and he will be talking about local walking for health schemes. Over to you, please, Ed.
Hi everybody, great to sort of speak to you all today about the work that we do at the Ramblers with our Walking for Health programme. It's fantastic to hear the work we've seen already around some of the built infrastructure, but what we do within the Ramblers is we do a lot of work around acquiring people into walking. So how does Ramblers Walking for Health work? We work with a variety of organisations, both statutory organisations and volunteer groups across the whole of England. And we have 360 schemes across England, and there are 2,000 walks enjoyed by 90,000 participants, and we have 88,000 volunteers who go and lead the walks. And really our work is targeted very much on people who don't walk or who are inactive, and trying to bring them into walking. Can I have the next slide, please? So we know that there are certain demographics that are less active and are doing less walking than others, and we know that as part of our work we really focus our energies into specific demographics. So we know that 85% of our walkers are over 55, over a third of our walkers have had at least one serious health condition, and also specifically with that we've had target around cancer with our previous supporters. So we do work very hard with our schemes to ensure that we bring people in who don't walk, to really acquire them into walking. Next slide, please. We do quite a lot of robust monitoring and evaluation of our programme, and part of our work really is to sort of link into health conditions. So we do report back to political commissioning groups and public health teams around the walks. And so what is working well is that we know that we see a lot of good improvements around various health measures, so weight loss, blood pressure. What we're also seeing is that there's improvement around social isolation, and work we've done recently has actually shown quite a lot of work around people who have been recently bereaved. So we've done a very good programme with Cruse Bereavement, who's a national charity. And also we've seen people are addressing health issues around anxiety. So really just bringing people into the joy of walking has helped people considerably. Next slide, please. So what is the important success factors of why this is working? Well, really it's the value of group walking, and we find that for a lot of people who are walking for the first time or coming into walking, going with a group is a far more easy way into becoming a walker than the challenges of going out walking by yourself into the built environment. The importance of a walk leader is really clear. It's really important that somebody is there helping and guiding and supporting somebody into walking. And also it's about being empathetic to somebody who doesn't currently walk, and really actually trying to sort of put yourself into their shoes. Also, what's really clear is that we deliver a number of focused walks. So we'll target a particular demographic, be it somebody who has just started walking, so that'll be towards our much shorter walks, or we might target a particular group, a particular community group, and offer some walks for them. So that's part of our package that we do. Working in partnership is very clear to what we do, working through our 365 delivery partners, but also going broader than that and working with various national charities so that we're all signposting into the walks and supporting people in that way. We do quite a lot of work of linking into the health sector and actually promoting it across to GPs and primary care, so people can see a way forward for people who are perhaps coming out of hospital or coming out of some serious illness. And finally, one of the real important element of this is that this is entirely volunteer delivered by the walk leaders. So actually recognizing that throughout the program has been really, really important to make sure people feel valued. Next slide, please. So we've got a couple of examples of people who do walk and always just trying to bring it to life. So we have Peter here, who did start walking after, unfortunately, his wife passed away. Just by him being a dedicated walk leader in Richmond, you know, he's found friendships. It's also improved his health and his blood pressure. And almost, he's got this wonderful record now of leading 100 walks in a year. So, you know, fantastic example of how this works. Next slide, please. Another good example from William, who had, unfortunately, another bereavement and started getting bouts of anxiety. But almost him coming into the walks increases confidence. He was being outside, so it supported his mental well-being and just fundamentally makes him more active as well. Next slide, please. And our final example was Cliff. A really kind of important element around Cliff was that he was unfortunately suffering from a number of health issues. COPD was the sort of big factor in, and almost him walking on a daily basis was really helping him, but also just to highlight the importance of his mental well-being and actually the fact that he made lots of friends through the group, and something that we hear throughout all the schemes that we have operating. So that's an overview of Ramblers Walking for Health and what we do there, really just trying to build in the acquisition of people into walking. So we feel that's a really, really important part of what is being done here to get people active and out walking in the built environment. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ed. That's some really interesting work that's going on there, and really good to hear about the sort of the personal examples at the end. That very much helps to bring it alive. And you know, I'm a fan of walking for all sorts of reasons, but particularly for health. And I was pleased to see, I don't know if people saw the article by Will Self that was published over the weekend that was in Men's Health magazine saying, don't go to the gym, go for a walk, and listing all the various benefits. So that was great to see. Really pleased now to introduce Emma Griffin, who is co-founder of Footways and also part of London Living Streets, and she will be talking about the Footways. Do I call it a project or a scheme? Footways, anyway. Over to you, Emma.
It's a good question. I don't know. I need to. I think I've got some slides. If I can. Great. There we go. I'm going to start. We've produced Central London Footways. I'm going to talk about where we're at with that, but also how this applies beyond Central London. So there's the map anyway. But I'll start with what kind of got us going. And I guess the first thing was that networks matter and walking networks matter. I guess any geographer will tell you how maps change how we think about cities. You know, the tube map, the A to Z, they kind of shrink the city in terms of distances and how easy it is to get around by certain forms of transport. Active travel is completely neglected, really, in terms of networking and mapping. Can I get the next slide? And this was an image from the back of the map that we produced that just showed you how easy and quick it is to walk between major hubs in central London. I think Euston to British Museum was 19 minutes to walk, hardly anything. Still a huge number of people take tube on that journey and taxis even. I think City Mapper says it takes just 17 minutes to take in a taxi once you've actually factored in the waiting time, and 16 minutes on the tube if you've done the kind of connections between the actual final destinations. So I can hear you saying, well, yeah, okay, our next slide actually, thanks. I can hear you saying, well, apps, as Glenn was talking about, apps are improving this. We've got City Mapper, we've got Google Maps, and they are showing us the kind of actual distances and times it can take to walk, and that's helping our decisions. But at the moment, those apps, as Glenn alluded to, are not doing enough. They're sending us down the busiest streets, and their algorithms are favouring time over the quality of the experience. So we're going down the busiest, most polluted, the noisiest, and unattractive streets. But walking is the one form of transport where environment really does matter. We are walking at a speed which allows us to really absorb what's around us, the feel of the street, the smell, the sounds. We haven't got a windscreen between us and the environment around us. We're not travelling at speed, so we're not worrying about who we're hitting or potentially or being hit by. So we can really enjoy our environment. So let's choose the streets that are the most attractive, the most appealing, there's enticing, historical, quietest, greenest, all these factors. So that was our starting point with the Central London Footways project. If I can get the next slide, thanks. So we applied for some funding from Transport for London as kind of, I guess, seed funding to get us going from this. My family's arriving now. I can hear them in the background. So if any children, I'm hoping they won't run in on the room now. So we got some funding, turned this into a printed map that was published last September. And Urban Good helped us produce this really lovely eye-catching design. If you want a map, I'm going to send my details of the map. Please email me and I'll send you a free copy of the map now. So yeah, and the idea was that we were connecting things. These are all the kind of mainline stations, the key hubs, the high streets, the places that people want to go. This is utility walking. This isn't leisure walking. This is getting from A to B, but in the most endurable way possible. And my colleague David Howes at London Living Streets was a historian. Originally, he was interested in using London's medieval street network for people walking and leaving the kind of more recent Edwardian and Victorian streets that were designed for the kind of horse-drawn and then motorised traffic for the through traffic. So map was printed last September, but this wasn't just about creating a network. This actually was about testing routes. And we have walked and talked with local councils across central London, with all the major cultural organisations, the big museums like the British Museum, the National Gallery, Exhibition Road Cultural Group, all the business, not all of them, a lot of the business improvement district, hospitals, about walking environments. And it's something about having a walking network, having a route that gets people out on streets, looking at what needs to change and thinking about what infrastructure improvements people walking need. And they are huge, as I'm sure as everybody on this event knows. We need a huge rebalancing of space for people walking, a reduction in traffic through schemes such as low traffic neighbourhoods. And we need all those, should be easy things really, but still not happening anywhere quick enough, the safe and the easy crossings for people on foot. I'm going to get the next slide just to show, even in central London, how far we have to come on this. This is a crossing outside Euston Station, hugely busy crossing, where people are arriving on from trains from the north. And this is what they are greeted with: a huge road without even a green man to help them across. No wonder that people are jumping on the tube or jumping in taxis and not taking their journeys to wherever they're going in central London by foot. So there are huge changes that need to happen. So anyway, and if we have the next slide, thanks. So we started in central London. Oh, and I should say that all these networks we actually are trying to get online, and we are working with to get it on OpenStreetMaps so the app developers can start using our networks. And we're already working with people like Go Jointly, which is great, but also hoping to get working with the city mappers, and Apple Maps have been in contact to those about how we're using algorithms. So I'd love to talk to some people about that, and hopefully to Glenn in the future about that as well. But beyond central London, there's already a lot of walking in central London, still could be a lot more, but really the greatest potential for more walking is when you go further out. In London, 62% of the potentially walkable trips that aren't currently walked are in outer London. And a lot of these trips are made by car, and a lot of these trips are for shopping. So we need to be building walking routes into these local town centres and the high streets. And that's probably connecting areas like I've got Stratford here, which I think is a great example, with some amazing walking routes that could be using the kind of blue routes along the rivers and the canals and through the parks and the green spaces in that area, and bringing people in by foot. And there might be some innovations that need to happen to get people shopping back home to them as well. But I'm sure that's also possible. And beyond central London as well, and beyond London as well, there's just huge amount that can be done to get people walking just a little bit further. So we're walking under a mile, that's kind of that people are 80% trips under 1 mile, but really when it gets a little bit further, there's a greatest potential there. And of course, there's huge potential to link this with all the work on low traffic neighbourhoods. Walking routes should be connecting all that low traffic work. We could be building walking networks into regeneration schemes. So when new places being developed, walking routes are kind of built into that from the outset.
Emma, can you start to finish up, because you've gone a bit over on your time. Thank you.
That's good. There we go. That's me. Please email me the last slide, and then I'll send you a free map and go and check out more. Thanks, Susan. Sorry.
That's fine. That's lovely. Yeah, and it's a beautiful map. I was very pleased to get mine last September. It is an absolute thing of beauty. So I encourage people to get a map from Emma. We've got one more speaker, and it's great to see there's some questions and some other comments coming in the chat, particularly about Will Self. I was obviously that was a dangerous thing to say, so do please post your comments or questions in the chat. And we have our final speaker, who is Tienery Lovell, who is the Inclusive Design Manager at Sustrans. And Tienery will be talking about walking in Liverpool neighbourhoods. So follows on, I think, nicely from what Emma was saying there. Over to you, please, Tienery.
Great stuff. Thanks so much, and thanks for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. So yeah, today I'm going to talk specifically about how significant walking is to creating livable cities and towns. Next slide, please. Great, thanks so much. So yes, at Sustrans, our vision is to create change is to create places that connect us to each other and what we need, where everyone who is able can thrive without having to use a car. Next slide, please. So at the heart of this vision is the ambition to address inequities across society. As we know, many of our places are designed around cars, not people, and the way that we travel or are forced to travel can disproportionately affect the poorest and most vulnerable. We know in Scotland, for example, up to 49% of households in the most deprived areas don't have access to a car, and it's the same in many other parts of the UK. Next slide, please. So fundamentally, as said, some of the other speakers have said, a key factor of a good walking environment is a place that isn't dominated by cars. Next slide, please. But a good walking environment isn't just about the lack of cars. It's also about the wider built environment, as Emma was just saying just there. It's a place that has a human scale, mixed land use, is pleasant and stimulating to be in, has a vibrant street life, provides eyes on the street, seating, trees, all the good things. Next slide, please. And the pandemic has also shown us how significant green infrastructure is to our walking environments and walking networks. Our connection to nature is vital, and this should be well integrated into developing walking projects. Next slide, please. But it's not just parks, which we know can be discriminating in themselves sometimes, particularly unattractive to some people at night. It's also about integrating green infrastructure into our streetscapes and urban environments. This image is the amazing Grey to Green scheme in Sheffield, where they've integrated low maintenance planting into the streetscape, and it's pretty amazing. So yeah, a good walking environment is about creating well-designed spaces that are pleasant to be in, not just dominated by cars. But to develop a walking environment that's successful, you have to first take a strategic approach. Like Anna says, it needs to be connected and cross-disciplinary. This is the City Centre Transformation Project in Edinburgh, which looks to create a pedestrian priority zone throughout the centre of the city. It's only possible, however, to make these kind of projects with a strategic look at transport across the network. So walking really needs to be considered as integral to transport planning more broadly if it's to be developed successfully. Next slide, please. And a strategic approach is not just important in our city centres, but also on smaller neighbourhood scales. So a few people have mentioned low traffic neighbourhoods already, schools, projects, these types of things. It's about considering walking not just on a street by street level, but on an area wide scale, which in turn can be more equitable than just designing A to B routes. Next slide, please. So I'd like to really hone in on inclusive design more specifically. What we consider as design for walking needs to broaden. Design for walking is multiple and varied. What does it feel like for a small child on a scooter? How would a blind or visually impaired person navigate the space? Are there sufficient public toilets in the area? Would the design accommodate the needs of those on the autism spectrum or those with dementia? These are all questions that should be at the heart of designing a project for walking. It's about respecting that people have varied bodies, varied lived experiences, and many things that might make certain things challenging or uninviting. So yeah, next slide, please. We also need to be critical in assessing schemes once they've gone in. So I just wanted to talk about these two images for a second. The image on the left shows someone in a mobility scooter using a cycle lane. It might be their first choice of route, but looking more closely at the image, it's apparent that it's likely to be their only choice because the footway is pretty inaccessible. There's cluttered and possibly an uneven surface. Similarly, the image on the right looks at first glance to perhaps a non-disabled user as an example of inclusive design. But in reality, many disabled people or wheelchair users would prefer not to share this type of space with the cyclist and would find it challenging to go in and out of the cycle lane into shops. So first and foremost, we need to make sure our footways and walking environments are truly accessible to all. And we can only do that by integrating as wide a variety of voices into the process as possible. Next slide, please. Lastly, I'd just like to talk about integrating joy and play and wonder into our walking schemes. It's not just for children, but for all users. Fundamentally, this is what's going to get people to choose walking over driving if they're able. Next slide, please. And so in conclusion, what makes a walkable place can be summarized in Sustrans' definition of livable cities and towns. So we believe they're places that have social connection at their heart, have most of what you need just a short walk away. They've got strong roots and they celebrate their unique character. They're easy for everyone to move around healthily in. They focus on for everyone there. And they have clean air and green space for all to live and play in. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much for that, Tierney. That was really interesting. And I think I particularly welcome the emphasis on inclusion. At Arup last year, we produced the guide with Sustrans on cycling for everyone, and we're now starting to work with Sustrans and Living Streets to produce a similar guide on walking for everyone, and think it's really important to focus on that aspect of inclusion, and love the idea of joy and play being important, way too often neglected. So that was a lovely sort of last thing to end on for the talk, so thank you for that. It's great to see there's some comments coming up in the chat. Lots of love for Emma's map and people wanting Emma's map, which is great. Comment there from I see from Anthony Bubb saying that, you know, how disappointing it is that sort of 31% of trips between 1 and 2 miles, only 31% are by walking, and I think the converse of that is the amount of really short trips that are undertaken by car that many areas are now focusing on. But a couple of points I think to bring up for the panel to get their views on, please. So Emma Pierce commented that, you know, there can be innovation for the planning, but what is the innovation for walking infrastructure? And I think that's really important, because often sort of people, they think, well, we've already got footways, you know, what's the new stuff? What's the shiny stuff that can go in to make walking better? So it would be great to hear views from the panel about innovation in terms of walking infrastructure. And I think aligned to that, there's also a comment made by Matt Higgins, who's saying, what is the most effective way to improve an ugly traffic-dominated concrete environment to encourage walking? I think we've heard bits of that, but if we can go through the panel, probably in the order in which you originally spoke, if that's okay. So starting off with Glenn. So innovation for walking infrastructure, and how do you improve an ugly traffic-dominated concrete environment?
Well, I should probably, first of all, Susan, put my hand up. I'm not going to pretend in the presence of experts and possibly even walking royalty to speculate too much about walking infrastructure and walkability, because I know many others will know a great deal more. Having said that, I think one of the challenges, of course, is when you look across to the likes of Google Maps navigation, its real capability is that it's massively scalable and therefore you adjust the service in one way and it's applicable globally and straight away. Whereas of course you're simply unable to do that, certainly at the same pace with infrastructure. And whilst I may have given the wrong impression, I'm not a technology evangelist, but I do wonder to what extent, because changing infrastructure is going to be slower, it's going to be a harder fought battle, certainly for some local authorities, to what extent digital technology can offer some sticking plaster or emulation of improved walkability. And I know this won't address everything, but in simple terms, of course, we're all aware now that the device accompanying us can give us at least a different acoustic experience, maybe even a greater sense of personal security than we would have if we were purely by ourselves and without that backing. So poor second, I know, to getting the walkability of the built environment right, but something to think about.
That's great. Thank you for that, Glenn. Anna, what are your views, please?
Yeah, I think my recommendation would be to start prioritizing and looking at the hierarchy of desire lines. So on top of that hierarchy would be places like that pedestrian crossing in front of Euston Station, which I'm very, very aware of. So that we really look at where are the right locations we should prioritize pedestrian movement over other forms of movement, and they should be first. And in the whole discussion, I think about low traffic neighborhoods, I think a big problem is that it's always black and white. It's like no vehicles at all, or, you know, it's not good enough. And I think I wish we would talk about traffic in the right places neighborhoods. So we would look at the whole neighborhood and all kind of needs for transport and find the right places for the right kind of transport. So it's a kind of balanced and very considerate approach. And then we can focus our investment for these public realm schemes, pedestrianization schemes, in the places where they're needed most and used most.
Thank you for that, Anna. Ed, please.
Yeah, I'm going to take a slightly different track based on the work that I do. I think it's very important, obviously, to sort of consider infrastructure in this, but I think there's always a concern I have that if we focus on that space, we're missing out on the person. And actually, I'd really advocate behaviour change interventions that are happening at a very local level to actually support people into walking. Recent Sport England figures show, I think we're up to about 16 million adults in England who aren't active, and a significant number of those aren't walking. And when we mean by not active, that's doing less than 30 minutes of activity, including walking a week. So I'm really a strong advocate for how we can kind of look at the system, the whole system, community groups, healthcare professionals, of actually, once infrastructure improvements are made, of actually how we can support people into walking. And you know, I'm an advocate of group walking, but there are ways beyond that. So technology plays a role potentially, but I'd be really interested to see how we can really make that intervention happen for the individual.
Great, thank you. Yeah, always good to focus on the people. Emma, your views, please.
I don't know where to start. I think I'm going to go quickly, so I do not get to. I guess more space. They need more space. I mean, wider pavements is an easy one. I mean, it's not an easy one, obviously, but that's where you start. Pedestrian priority at side road crossings. There's some beautiful, expensive things you can do, but side road zebras, which I know have been worked on by Brian Deegan, is pushing that in Manchester at the moment, which is great. And then there's the safe crossings, the easy crossings, the quick crossings. Not having to wait very long at a crossing would be helpful for people walking. Then there's all the extra things like more seating and all the kind of things that just actually make walking possible, especially if you aren't able to walk long distances. And then the drop curbs and things like that, which make, if you're in a wheelchair or with a buggy, so completely impossible. But I guess, like, most of all, just less traffic. I think fewer cars on streets just make walking so much easier and enjoyable. I'm going to have to stop there.
Thanks for that, Emma. And Tierney, your views, please.
Yeah, lots already been said, and I suppose for me, innovation in walking isn't necessarily about kind of all singing, all dancing technology, but it's about the voices that are sort of amplified in the process of developing schemes. And I think innovation might be something quite low tech in the future, but it should be about making our public spaces more equitable. I think one of the things we're talking about, you look back to things like the development of tactile paving in Japan and the 60s and things, and that was really quite a step change in terms of accessibility of our streets, and really quite an innovation of its time. Now we take it for granted, but what's the sort of similar things that are being explored now? What more can we do, and what more would be helpful for disabled people in particular to get about? And I feel like that's where the innovation should really focus on, to address these inequalities.
Great, thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, it's good to see some of the comments, and Glenn has posted in the chat about actually getting cars off the footway and pavement parking. And for me, you know, for a long time I talked about the nice things you can do to improve walking, and there are lots of them, and we've talked about a number of them today. And one of the things I feel strongly about is provision of things like public toilets, which I think is absolutely fundamental to a human city and to improving walking. But more and more, I'm of the view that, you know, it is reducing that traffic dominance. It's what I refer to as sort of transport gluttony. These bigger and bigger vehicles traveling faster, taking up more space, parking on the footway, just really making it an unpleasant environment in which to walk, as we've noted. And I think, as Emma was saying, when you've got fewer cars on the street, it just does make it very, very different. Trying to scan down to see there's more comments. I think there's a fair bit in the chat about sort of the zebra crossings and signal controlled crossings. But just looking to see if there are any particular question about.
If I could just jump in a previous comment about the infrastructure, one really important element of our walking, for the group walking and the demographic that we have, is the provision of places for people to sit. You know, just simple actual elements for older people and people who have perhaps got a long-term health condition. Actually, it's a scary world out there, but if they have some places to sit, and I equally agree with you around sort of public conveniences as well. You know, these small interventions just mean a huge amount for people.
Yeah,
so
no,
more about the better, really. It's not just necessarily the road. You're thinking of the old environment around it.
yeah, definitely. It was good to see. I think it's in the Railton low traffic neighbourhood where they've got the planters, and they've incorporated seating into the planters, and they've now incorporated really low areas of seating for sort of toddlers. So you get the high level bench and the lower level bench, which is really nice to see. There's an interesting post by Julian Sanchez that says innovation in walking might be more focused on winning the argument with political leaders in a way that is starting to happen with cycling. And I think that's a really interesting one. I listened to the panel this morning where Will Norman was saying what he thinks is three things that are needed. The first one is political leadership and political backbone. The second is technical skills and expertise from officers. And then the third one is the sort of the campaigning communities. And I think it'd be really interesting to hear from the panel how we can get politicians more engaged in walking. There are very few politicians who will talk enthusiastically, whereas I think it should be a massive vote winner in terms of improving walkability. There isn't much, I don't think, that politicians can do that benefits so many of their constituents, generally in a way that doesn't disbenefit that many. You know, sometimes, yes, if it's taking away parking space, we all know the challenge of that. But what can be done to better engage politicians and get them to appreciate the benefits that can come both for people, for places, and for them as politicians in terms of votes? It would be great to hear. If we go, maybe we go in reverse order. So start with Tierney and make our way back to Glenn, if that's okay this time.
Yeah, I think it's a tricky one, because I think sometimes walking infrastructure gets kind of confined to just rearranging a curb line or putting in a drop curb. These sort of details, they can be seen as quite dry and not particularly engaging. And I think that's what I was trying to get at in terms of integrating green infrastructure and play and place, and something that it's really about making an environment more pleasant. That in turn benefits local business, it benefits a sense of community, it helps to prevent social isolation, all these things. So I think really selling walking in terms of the overall picture about place and improving place is key for the political side. But yeah, it's a tricky one, definitely.
Thanks, Tierney. Emma.
Yeah, what we found really useful with the Footways project was that with politicians, local politicians, actually just getting people to see walking from an A to a B, seeing walking as a form of transport that gets people from places to other places, and then walking those routes and looking at all the things that get in the way has been a really great way to get a discussion going and getting people thinking about things. So any politicians, you know, want to walk a Footways walk, let us know. And if and our map is a great tool for that. I think even a reminder that walking is transport is a good start.
Thanks, Emma. So Ed, would you like to give some views?
Yeah, I think it's one thing that's perplexed me through my career is actually trying to get that political influence is challenging. I think my observations will always be is what can be done at a local level. I think local authorities are probably well placed to kind of make local interventions. So, you know, I always feel that's a good way forward. Selling a story, I think, is always helpful. I think, you know, we're fortunate in what we do is that we've got some good stories that we can talk up. And finally, I think it's just building that evidence base, you know, of how we sort of making changes to people's lives. And within that evidence base has to be some sort of cost saving thing around what cost savings can we do around with the NHS, with social cohesion. But I think within all that, there's work for us all to do in that space, you know, building up that evidence. I think there is infrastructure, there's myself in practical sort of delivery of walking, academia. It feels like other sectors have got that well organised and we perhaps don't have that bringing together.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the selling a story side of it would be a really powerful way to get the message across. Anna, what's your view and how do we get politicians involved?
I think the work we do with local authorities is typically around public health. So the interest in reducing the cost to the NHS and social care delivery. And also many local authorities have now goals in relation to carbon emissions, reductions of carbon emissions and air quality, kind of environmental factors. And of course, there's also the area of economic development and studies which can show that walkable neighborhoods have different types of property values and attract people to the shops and things like that. So I think it's a combination of those three areas which seem to resonate with local authorities.
Great, thank you. And finally, you, Glenn.
Susan, actually, Sergio in the chat picked up the first point I was going to make, which is, you know, let's follow in the footsteps of Sir Terry Lee here. And I'm not advocating whether he's a good or bad leader formerly of Tesco's, but, you know, let's walk the shop floor. I remember one of the biggest impacts that I had was when I was a senior manager at the university and we brought in a set of wheelchairs and senior managers signed up to spend part of their day experiencing being wheelchair bound, being a wheeler on campus. And it was an amazing eye-opener. And I think we failed time and time again, both as a transport planning profession, but also in encouraging local councillors, you know, spend one council meeting walking and talking in the very environment that you're talking about to your voters. But I think the other two things, you know, what's changed right now that could be different to the last 5 years, the last 10 years? Well, of course, so many local authorities have declared a climate emergency, and it's just possible they're getting themselves into a corner now where if there really is an emergency, there's got to be an acceptance of a need for a different type of change. And of course, walking is crying out to be part of the answer as well as its health benefits. But I think to be canny, one also has to tap into the mainstream, if you like, that here we are in a world where, for example, the Future of Mobility Urban Strategy from the UK Department for Transport was actually under the auspices of the industrial strategy. You know, how does walking connect into creating more wealth, more inward investment to the UK, more jobs in our national and local economies? How does it tap into innovation, which seems to excite investment in R&D and the engagement of more stakeholders? You know, we can rail against that, but I think to some extent we ought to be thinking, how can we tap into that and excite through the channels people are already exploiting for other modes and innovations?
Great, thank you for that. It'll be interesting to know in the chat if people have particular thoughts about who they have found to be the real political champions for walking. I would say for me, one of them would definitely be Lillian Greenwood. But I think, you know, there is a dearth. People associate more readily with cycling than with walking. So I would nominate Lillian Greenwood as my walking champion. But I'd love to hear from other people who they would have in the chat, and let's see what sort of names we get. We've got a question here. I'm not sure it's Neve or Neam, apologies, Sutherland, which is, what do you anticipate the impact of Active Travel England and the gear change funding will be for the pedestrian network? I think many of us, when gear change came out, were perhaps slightly disappointed at the balance between walking and cycling in it, and you know, maybe the title gives it away, but it would be interesting to hear from the panelists. And let's start at the middle this time. So we start at Ed and then go on to Emma and go around in that order. So, you know, what do you see as the impact of Active Travel England and the gear change funding for the walking network?
Yeah, I'm going to have to confess, you know, I think that area around Active Travel England is still something that's potentially new for us and a new avenue. So I'm still sort of waiting on what that will look like. Potentially, you know, our work tends to lean into Sport England and Public Health England. So I'm always excited of where there are organisations that are championing this work. So if there's opportunities to work, you know, we want to evolve our walking offer to actually support people to get walking. So part of that is the Active Travel position. So that doesn't really answer the question, other than saying new organisations are always hopefully there to go and help.
Thanks, Ed. Emma, what are your thoughts, please?
Yeah, I hope it actually really means actual for infrastructure improvement, major change, and going back to all the things we talked about earlier. And it's not just walking and cycling, you know, it's walking as well. I mean, walking and cycling, as people have been talking in the chat, are really complementary. Low traffic neighbourhoods really do complement each other, but walking does have its own requirements, and it isn't just the kind of and walking at the end. It's got to be really central to what people need, and there are specific things in the space for people walking. There is so much more, and reductions in parking, so forth. So I hope that's a really committed approach to it. I'm sorry, I'm not going to say more than that. I'll pass on.
Thanks, Emma. Tierney.
Sure. Yeah, I'm actually based in Scotland, so it's interesting to compare perhaps the two nations in terms of approach, in that we've been sort of dealing with a fund of money for active travel and how that's been distributed for a few years, and I wonder it might play out in similar ways in England. But I think with that fund, the most successful projects really have been the ones across the board that have considered like walking particularly integrated into the whole project. As I said, projects like the city centre transformation in Edinburgh, that's considered walking as part of the transport strategy. So looking not just at cycling, not just at walking, but looking at transport as a whole and making sure walking is at the heart of that. So I think it's very hard to have these conversations about walking if it's not looking at sort of traffic permeability at the same time. So I think all projects for walking and cycling will only be better if they're looking at transport more generally.
I'm going to have to come into that because I think it's so important. I mean, a bus journey is also a walking journey, and those two things should be integrated together. They're all part of the same thing, and when you start connecting them, then real change can happen for all of the transport. Sorry.
No, I agree. I mean, we know that in London, you know, half of walking is done in association with public transport, and you know, that's why I'm always keen to talk about people walking rather than pedestrians. You know, rather than labelling someone as a pedestrian or a cyclist or a motorist, because most of us do a number of different modes at different times and on different days. So I always think walking is a much better term than pedestrian. Glenn, what's your view, please?
I've got so excited listening to the conversation and following the chat, so I may just plunge in with a couple of reactions to the flow.
Please do.
But at the moment, I'm doing a little bit of work with Scott Kane for Carla Jakeman, that some of you may know, Innovate UK. And Carla touched upon this idea, which she calls combo travel, which may not sound, in one sense, particularly innovative, but her focus, her interest is particularly on the health motivations for combining, just as Emma's been saying, the end legs of our journeys with motorised main modes. And it's interesting when one looks in the literature, I get the impression, I'm happy to be corrected, that there's actually been very little interest in the UK, from an academic perspective at least, in this particular idea, though of course it's quite rampant in the Netherlands and also in the US if you're looking at bike racks on buses and so on. But only one paper did I find where there was reference to understand whether people walked to a more distant bus stop. I thought, how wonderful, why aren't we seeing that? That's true innovation. And if I may just have a quick grumble about the vision for cycling and walking. I mean, my goodness, we've either got a modal hierarchy or we haven't got one. And if we have one, unless I've missed it, walking is at the top of the hierarchy above cycling. And I have nothing against cycling, but it should have been step change, a vision for walking and cycling. Come on, let's up our game. This is just not good enough.
Great, yeah, completely agree with that. And yeah, I'm always a big fan of the modal hierarchy, having reduced the need to travel at the very top, then walking, then cycling, public transport, access servicing, and private cars at the bottom. But recognizing people do go by different modes. And I think we've lost Anna Rose by the looks of it. She seems to have dropped off the chat, unfortunately. But yeah, again, there's sort of quite a bit of talk about having a walk the walk type thing and walking with local politicians. I guess the difficulty is how we actually engage with them to do it. And I do think walking should be seen as a good vote winner and a good priority for politicians, and it should be walking for everyone, not just the articulate sort of lobbying brigade of people walking, but it's how you actually engage all of that. Just trying to see if there are other questions that have come up. Yeah, Julian's liking your hierarchy expressed with such enthusiasm, Glenn, so that's good to see.
So can I ask you a question just while you're looking?
Yeah, sure.
I recall how passionate you've been when I crossed paths with you at conferences in taking your own team on walking talks, and I wonder whether this starts at home really. So before we talk about convincing our politicians, I mean, I'll confess to being a rather late developer in terms of evangelizing about walking, but I don't know whether you could say a little bit more for us about how you found that and whether it has positive influence in the approach your transport planning colleagues then take.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, for me, one of the joys about walking is we can all make a difference, and we can make a difference through our own individual behaviour, and we can make a difference through our interactions with colleagues. So, yeah, when we were in the office, I was always a big fan of having, whether it was to do with an actual project and going to see the site, or whether it was just to do with something else. And it's the quality of conversations that you get when you're out walking. But also I found running some of the walkability courses for PTRC, when you actually get a bunch of transport planners out and focus on it and look at everything from a walking lens, people start to see things in a very different way. They notice a street in a different way. They notice the environment. They notice people in a different way. So yeah, I think it's really important to have those discussions with your own colleagues. I still have some colleagues who will refer to things like soft modes, and it's like, or soft measures, and it's like, no, they are not soft. It's sort of like, don't dismiss walking and cycling as being soft. And I think it's really important sometimes that we challenge each other as well, because it is easy to overlook what's seen as sort of so fundamental to our life that we don't need to do anything about it. So I think, yeah, we need to challenge ourselves and always think about our own behaviour. We challenge our colleagues. It's how we behave in our everyday life. It's how we engage in my own area in Islington, where some of the local traffic neighbourhoods have been low traffic neighbourhoods have been going in. I tend not to engage on Facebook pages because I've realised that is severely bad for my health, and next door lists are even worse. But actually talking to people out on the street, can be a good way. And I had a interesting conversation with a guy who was on a mobility scooter, and he was like, "Oh, not another road closure." And I was like, "Yeah, but doesn't it make it better for you?" "Yeah, but it's just a money-making exercise." And I was like, "Can you tell me why?" "Well, it's just the council making money." "Can you tell me why?" And we had this nice conversation at the end. He was like, you've completely changed my mind. And I wasn't out to change his mind. I was just questioning what he said. So yeah, I think we can all do our bit to improve walkability. But I think engaging with politicians is a really important one in terms of having that priority. And I think that's where the sort of campaigning communities really come into their own as well, that Will was talking about. And again, I mean, I think sometimes I think we've got so many interest groups that their voices don't tend to be heard so much. So I suppose if I look in my own borough of Islington, you know, very many people all want the same thing, but sometimes it's a clean air focus, sometimes it's a cycling focus, sometimes it's a walking focus, sometimes it's Extinction Rebellion. And all of these groups don't get heard so much because there are so many of them, whereas if you could actually bring them together, I think that they'd be a lot stronger. So yeah, thank you for that. That means I've been neglecting the questions though. So has anything else come up in terms of the, I can't talk and read, that's my trouble. Comment about walking for local businesses, which I think is really important, and someone refers to the Living Streets Pedestrian Pound report, and we said earlier about the importance of the evidence base, and I think we are now getting to a stage where we have that evidence base. You know, there's such strong evidence out there. Yes, it has tended to be London dominated, but it's sort of like we know walking schemes have good cost benefit or benefit cost ratios. We know they're good for health. We know they're good for the economy. We know they're good. You know, it's all of those good things, but somehow it's how do we get that message across, which I guess again does come down to the politicians. So it's yeah. Let me see any other questions. Have the panel got questions they would like to ask each other while I'm scanning down some of the comments here?
I'll ask one of Emma, if I may. Emma, I was very pleased that you said more about, you know, effectively finding the most walkable routes, and the maps you were showing, both of which I find inspiring, but I just wonder how challenging the scalability of that is. So in a sense, you've made the product probably as much more usable and accessible than some digital maps, and yet perversely it's probably the least accessible until it's digitized and it's widely understood and awareness is there.
We had a call actually with Apple about how we made the map, and they learned from what the processes that we used to determine these routes, and whether their algorithms could learn from it to make it a scalable solution for the whole world. And they were really interested. I don't know whether they were just coming with their Californian kind of optimism, saying that the algorithms could easily collect all this data in terms of numbers of people or shop front windows or people on the street, all these things that you could potentially measure, which are the factors that we were really using, whether they could learn from the human part of it. And Go Jointly they've just come out with, I'm sure you must know the new tool that they've got to choose green routes. So I think it's happening. I think it is scalable. You could learn from our kind of human approach and get learning from that to expand it. I'm sure it is possible. At the moment, we're getting an OpenStreetMap, and we're going to see what app developers do. Our data is going to be open for anyone to use in the way that they want, and we'll see what happens with it. But you're right, at the moment, it's volunteer-led, it's human-led, it's getting people out there testing routes. But yeah, I would love to chat more about where this could go. So,
okay, thanks.
For that, there's a comment coming from Kit Allwinter that we're all agreed that telling the story is so important and that we need to make sure we do this well. What are the best examples that the panel have seen of this story being told that we can take inspiration from? Any member of the panel want to offer a view on that?
I have to say, without sounding too sort of sycophantic, I actually thought Ed's stories were really inspiring. The ones about kind of bereavement, and it made me think about this talk about the way we talk about walking, and I feel like things are shifting in post-pandemic situation where, you know, we've been talking about walking in terms of transport and A to B and getting to services and getting to work and getting to shops, but that the well-being side of things, I feel, has got a heightened importance since the pandemic, and possibly will do in future if we're more working from home and our transport patterns change going forward. I just think that sort of really centering on the well-being side that Ed did was really, really great.
Thanks, Tierney. Yeah, I agree. Other thoughts?
Yeah, for a start, I mean, it's obviously nice to hear that, and I think I would, echo that there are actually some incredibly lovely stories out there. I think we're only really scratching the surface, if I'm honest. I think there's more out there. I think the opportunity of social isolation and whether that can be done through some forms of technology, I think it'd be really interesting. So, I think there's more to be done in that space, and using walking as the path to do that. Just as a kind of nice thing that's happening locally that I sort of volunteer and support in is a walking program that links people coming out of an NHS rehab centre, people who've had falls and strokes and so forth. And actually, they're just taking them, the client group there locally, for a walk to build up their confidence. And the built infrastructure really comes into that. It's so important, especially for people who have had medical interventions. So it's a good example of that that's happening in West London, and potentially, hopefully, if there are more like that, would be excellent to see.
Mm. Emma, Glenn, thoughts? Yeah, Glenn.
I'm broadening out, I suppose, like Tierney. I liked Ed's examples of essentially of messengers, but you've mentioned real self, Susan, and indeed I was reading something on social media earlier this week, which was focusing on Dolly Parton and the playlist that you have in your headphones or the podcast, and I don't know whether it's just that when one gets closer to a subject you discover more things that were always there, but I get the impression that walking is genuinely, and partly of course to do with COVID, is being more popularized now. And of course, when one looks back, it was the poor person's last resort. And yet now, I think it's the cool person's first recourse, actually. If you've got your step counter, and in my case, you've got your heavy metal in your headphones, you've got the liberation, you've got the autonomy because the navigation's there. Yes, of course, you need that walkable route that Emma's trying to steer us towards. So then you need those messengers, but the messengers that resonate with the particular target populations that we think are most important to encourage in greater numbers to behave in incorporating walking.
Yeah, I agree. There's never hasn't been so much talking about walking as a result of COVID as ever before. I mean, the national newspapers, there's continual stories about all sorts of different angles on walking and the kind of revelations that people are having on their daily walks and the freedoms of it. I think stories are really coming. I missed the BBC BBC 4 documentary with the poet I've suddenly forgotten the name of that was doing walking. I think, yeah, this is the time for walking has come.
I think what's really interesting is that I think the Guardian did a really wonderful thing of Year of the Walker last year, and we're right, more people are walking than ever, but yet COVID has shown us, the massive disparities that are out there, and there are a lot of people who have been socially isolated through COVID, have become more inactive, if that's possible for some people who were very low active as it started. So it's really enthusiastic to see that people are walking, but actually, what about those people who don't? And I think, my question to the panel and people listening is, how do we actually support those people who were scared beforehand of going outside, and now with the global pandemic are even more scared of going outside, and all the social and health issues that are coming from that? Walking is the most accessible activity we have out there. How can we actually pull those people outside? And those people might not have the access to technology, they might not have the access to support, and that's my big question for us all, really.
Yeah, I think that's a really important one. I mean, I think probably, all of us would fall into the category of enthusiastic walkers, and I am a big supporter, not surprisingly, of living streets and the walking from home and the sharing the experiences and things. But there's a danger that we're in the echo chamber of talking to each other, and it's the people who don't have the confidence to or don't wish to, or for whatever reason, get across the front door and literally make those first steps. And I think it's recognizing how much harder it is when the majority of hours are in darkness and with poor weather, So yeah, I think you're entirely right, and the group support is fantastic that you've been offering through your scheme. But again, it's helping people, every pun intended, to make that first step, and it's how do you make that first step. So no, really good point. Just looking at the chat, there's a comment by, which I think is a good one, by Kathy Azapardi, saying many council strategy policy documents focus on journeys of up to 1 mile as walkable and under 3 miles as cyclable, but this doesn't allow for Emma's point of 1 to 2 mile walking trips or easy over 5 mile plus rides. And how can we push for greater change with such low aspirations? Which I think is a really important one. You talk to many people who, particularly car drivers, who don't, their idea of walking more than a mile, they just wouldn't conceive of doing it, sort of thing. So I think that's really interesting. We're running towards the end of this session. I think we're due to finish at 1:15. So I think what would be really good is, unfortunately, I said we have lost Anna, but if it's possible to hear from the panelists one last time with their, I guess, one thing you really want the people listening to take away from this session. So we're at the end of this day, which has been looking at cycling and walking innovations. I'm pleased that walking is having the final word, so that's good. But really, just I think to finish on, what is the one key thing you want to stick in the heads of the people that are listening, or the message you want to take them away? So I'll just give you a moment to think about that while I look at the comments. Yeah, in terms of sort of the echo chambers. Oh, Anna's just come back. That's good. Susie Aker-Smith says the people you need in this conference are unfortunately not here. The council leaders, highway leads, and our MPs. All the people here are completely in support of the ideas. Yes, I agree. I thought in the past that maybe we need to have sort of stealth conferences, where you have a conference that say it's going to be talking about, I don't know, something to do with highway engineering, or something to do with something that will draw people in, and then you get all these people here, and then you say, surprise, we're going to talk about this instead, sort of thing. So I've never heard of anyone having a stealth conference, but I do like that idea. So yeah, because I think otherwise, and I know Twitter is like this. I love Twitter, big fan, but it is that echo chamber, and it's how do you get to those people who are not having those discussions at the moment. And Juliana's saying in response to Susie that she will check the delegate list. There may well be some MPs, etc., and flagging up that we do regularly work with your party parliamentary group on cycling and walking and councillors, and it's great that they've now got walking attached to that as well as cycling. So in the last few minutes, I don't know whether you caught this, Anna, but I was just going to go through the panel. We'll go in reverse, so we'll start with Tierney and end with Glenn, which is what is the one thing, the one message that you would like people who have been listening to this afternoon and today to take away. So Tierney, to you, please.
It's tricky, but I think the one message for me is for people to think more broadly about what they consider walking infrastructure to be, and to think more broadly about the types of users that might be types of people who might be using a scheme, and thinking about walking not just A to B, but also about play, about green space, about the pleasure of being somewhere.
Great, thank you. Emma.
Yeah, going back to the point that Kathy made about how do you push for greater change with such low aspirations? Maybe we need to be thinking about what we get from transport, and what are the factors we use when we decide what transport to take. It's not just about speed and getting there as quickly as possible, being delivered from one place A to B with nothing in between. It's actually the experience of transport itself can be what actually can really change our lives and build not just health in, but mental well-being and just thinking time and all these extra things. So we have to kind of revalue what we want from transport.
Great, thank you. And Ed, please.
I think the big takeaway is just considering the individual, and actually when I talk about the individual, it's the individual who doesn't walk, and actually what behaviour change interventions, projects, activities can we make to go and support people who are currently not walking. I think those people who are walkers, walking evangelists, I think there's a lot out there for them. Let's really think about those people who aren't active or mobile at this time.
Great, thank you for that, Ed. Anna, hopefully that's given you enough time to think of yours.
Yes, I'm really sorry about this. technological glitch. So what I take away from this, even more listening to everyone, is that we should apply some systems design thinking to all of this, and stop thinking just about transport or just about urban design. We need to think about people, we need to think about places, and we need to connect all these dots and have a more holistic approach and have all the different stakeholders from all these different disciplines coming together. And the same across society, the different stakeholders in politics, the people themselves, users. I think we need to look at this in a much more holistic way and bring things more together.
Great, thank you. And Glenn, you have the final word. No pressure.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've got anything profound to add, but I do think it comes back to, walking more of the walk before we talk the talk, and encouraging the low-hanging fruit, if you like, encouraging fellow transport planners to start with to walk that walk, and then as a result of that, seeing how that infection and enthusiasm might spread more widely. I know, of course, coming back to my love of wazzing, which is a terrible phrase, I know, but before lockdown, within my small sphere, it was clearly becoming more and more infectious and being normalized and popularized. It was cool to think you go from meeting to meeting, or jump off take off the tube and stop early and walk a bit further. And I think that imagination can be captured, but we do need to start by walking the walk.
Great. That's a great point to end on. So